All right, as promised, today I am going to delve into an examination of Kratos and social depictions, artistic depictions of masculinity. And I tend to touch on the feminine side in my work more, but every once in a while I like to do this partially to balance it out and partially to just talk about a character I really, really love and relate to. And this may reveal more about me than intended. Lucky you. I don't know what it says about me that I can connect to a character this way, but there you have it. I'm cool and special. But I want to start off by saying that the whole idea, you guys know I don't like analyzing video game characters as symbols of masculinity and femininity. I like to analyze them as individuals and artistic creations. But the thing about Kratos is he does leverage two huge masculine archetypes, that of a warrior and that of a father. And contrary to popular belief, that was true in the first series of games as well as this one, especially the PSP games. Kratos' relationship with his daughter Calliope is explored fairly in depth. Calliope may not be on the screen as much as Atreus is, but you know, his Kratos's feelings towards his daughter are very much a major part of his story early on. But the way the previous God of War games and now the current God of War game show that the role of warrior and the role of father are pretty incompatible in sort of the boxes that men get sorted into in those two roles. And the box that sort of father inhabits is different than the box that mother inhabits, but single dad is, you know, it sort of bridges the two, because now Kratos can't be the sort of absentee father that his original culture in Sparta treated as completely normal. Now he has to be a hands-on dad. And the reality of not just his past, but his present conflicts very much with the role of father, because a big part of being a father, and especially the father of a son, is the responsibility fathers feel to teach their sons how to be a man. And Kratos has a unique challenge in that, because he's really not happy with his past. He doesn't see himself as a man at all. He flip-flops between identifying as a god and then identifying as a monster. And that's the thing about soldier's guilt, is that, you know, especially modern day fatherhood is about nurturing and giving life and wisdom and, you know, imparting knowledge, and being a soldier is about killing. And there's nobility and sacrifice and all that stuff tied up in it, but the killing part isn't super compatible with our modern ideas of parenting. And, you know, Kratos's conundrum goes deeper than that, because he's, in the case of the new game, an immigrant in a very tribal culture and an old man in a culture where the average life expectancy is 40. So, you know, the displacement, the confidence he had in being an ideal Spartan isn't here when he's an outsider among the Norse. And one of the big differences between Norse culture and Spartan culture, or Spartan culture, as non-Canadians like to say. We like to crush our T's. But the Norse had very different customs than the Spartans about sex. And it's interesting how they reflected it in this game. The Norse they sort of deflected. They had a lengthy list of euphemisms in their stories when it came to sex. Unlike most Greek cultures who, put pornography on like clay pots. Very, very different attitudes towards the body, towards sexuality, towards sex, the role sex played. The interesting thing is, the God of War games are pretty historically accurate. And, it's unsaid, but Spartan armies had, they sort of practiced enforced homosexuality. So that would be part of Kratos' background, because he's an ideal Spartan soldier. But, the idea, his attitudes towards sex would have, and I never felt like Kratos was really big on the way sex worked in Sparta. I would love to be able to see him at some point actually in a relationship instead of his wife being dead, because I'd love to actually see that, because Kratos is capable of very deep feeling. That's something they've established a lot. He doesn't necessarily feel a lot of good emotions a lot of the time, but he is capable of them. He's not a psychopath. The way he speaks about his wives in both games, it's in order to feel that sense of loss that he has, he would have to feel deep love as well. It's not just guilt, it's a sense of loss. And he speaks, especially in this game, with his late wife Faye, with a lot of respect and a lot of admiration and caring. And I thought that was a really important character point. I think his second marriage was somewhat different from the first, because it was something he did on his own terms. He'd come out of, that lengthy revenge plot in the original games, the games set in Greece, and he realized revenge didn't make him feel better. He actually seemed fairly happy before all this stuff went down again. And that's interesting too, because one of the things that this God of War game does is the central question is what it means to be a man, couched in the language of what it means to be a god. The whole question of what does it mean to be a god, be it a god of war or god of anything, is just an exaggeration of, what it means to be a good leader of men. And, leading by example is a huge element of that. And in this game, we discover that what it means to be an ideal man, according to Kratos, is to only kill when necessary and to be better than those that came before you. And that is a really interesting take on masculinity for Kratos, because other men would say, no, you never kill at all. Killing's wrong. Sort of the Christian approach to things, turn the other cheek. That's not Kratos. He doesn't believe in avoiding killing at all cost, only when it's necessary, which is a really important establishment of his worldview. But he also believes his wife was better than him, because there's one line where he says that his wife was better than a god. Meaning better than him. And I think that's sort of tied up in the guilt and trauma that Kratos has carried around with him from the first game. And when people start slamming these games, I get very, very angry, because I feel like it's disrespecting a huge part of the sacrifice that soldiers make. When we talk about sacrifice and military service, it's not just about the people who die or lose limbs or, get burned. Every soldier sacrifices because they have to do things for that job that they're trying to prevent the rest of us to have to do. The difference between killing as a part of military service and just going out and murdering someone can't be understated. In a state of war, it is very different. I mean, there are a lot of different reasons why, but the whole idea of, a casus belli, a just war, is central. But even if you believe the killing is just, the killing is not without consequence, right? And the interesting thing about Kratos is both a soldier and a murderer. And what's interesting in this God of War game is that the death that haunts him is him killing Zeus. And, if you played the original games, you know that was the killing he chose. Everything else was just part of the assembly line to get to Zeus, to avenge the fact that the gods had taken him over and caused him to kill his wife and child, but also, numerous other soldiers and things like that. All the other deaths in the game are coerced somehow. He feels that those were necessary. There seems to be an underpinning of he no longer necessarily thinks that killing Zeus was necessary, and I think it's because it didn't make him feel better. And I mean, Ares, yeah, that was directly avenging his wife and daughter's death. He can justify that to himself. With Zeus, it was personal. And that's really interesting because Kratos, the game makes it very clear, considers himself a monster. Whereas the academic criticism of God of War tends to treat Kratos as a masculine ideal. He's an idealized embodiment of hypermasculinity. And what's interesting is that's not what Kratos feels about himself. That has been made very clear. In the first games, he was shunned practically everywhere he went. He was certainly not treated as an ideal man, held up for praise. He was treated as a monster. So the fact that the critics do not accept, and in fact openly reject, Kratos' own self-definition to, label him ideal masculinity and what does this say about modern masculinity? Well, I think that the critics' rejection of the information that is actually in the God of War games says more about our ideals, our ideas surrounding masculinity in the modern world. It begs the question, do we consider masculinity to have an element of inherent monstrosity? Signs seem to point to, in certain quarters, yes, to take the Christian pacifist approach to it, it does demonize this sort of older masculine archetype in a way that I think we really need to examine and we really have to question. Because Kratos, quite frankly, in these games is depicted as an example of what not to do if you want to be happy and well regarded. He is a great soldier. He had great military acclaim, but he's had a life of tragedy and loss. And in his past life, he was more like a weapon than a person. And this is where I get into the discussion of Kratos as the male face of trauma. And this, how men process grief and how men process trauma, I personally think are really poorly recognized. And I think that's why why there's so many soldiers coming back with severe PTS, or, in civilian terms, PTSD. Kratos has all the major symptoms of PTS. Military PTS. When I talked to David Jaffe about it, he said it was absolutely not in their minds. It was just so woven into Greek stories that it ended up there. But if you go through the checklist, they're all there. The major pillars are re-experiencing the trauma through flashbacks. That's a major part of these games. Then there's emotional numbness and avoidance of places, people, and activities that are reminders of the trauma. That's there in spades in a lot of these games. It's obvious in one part in this one that's a major spoiler at the halfway mark. They say increased arousal. That word has a different term in non-psychological parlance. It's often classified as hypervigilance, and this includes being easily irritated and angered. Ding, ding, ding. And then there's sort of a checklist. If you have any two of these, you have a classic PTS diagnosis. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about self. Kratos calling himself a monster certainly applies. Persistent guilt or shame, obviously. Feelings of detachment from others, yep. Persistent inability to experience positive emotions, and then aggressive and self-destructive behavior. Now, those were the ones I isolated from a very long list, but you only needed 2, and we have like 6 or 7 here. So this character that so many so-called experts attack as problematic, or as I saw one person call him a murder dad. Ugh. He's actually a portrait of a man in pain. And this is why I keep talking about this, because when these so-called experts reject these very honest, very uniquely vulnerable depictions of a man in pain, because through Kratos we get to see sort of behind the mask that a lot of men put up when they're hurting, because we get him in his private moments. We get to see him when he is, in the fictional world alone. We get to see beyond the cover that he puts up, trying to protect other people from what he's going through. And by rejecting this very honest, very deep story of a man who's deeply, deeply, deeply hurting and deeply traumatized, I believe, and I believe the reason that the reactions among gamers to these criticisms have been so strong, because when they see these so-called experts, these so-called defenders of all that is good, rejecting an examination of a man in pain, they themselves feel rejected because their own pain is not being validated and not being treated as real, as important, and something they should get support getting through. And I realized that was sort of what was at the core of my, oh, screw you, my very strong reaction to the criticisms of this character in particular. Other characters I can be more prosaic about the stupid things that people get wrong. But when it comes to Kratos, I rage of the gods. Just, R3, L3, boom, roar, red attacks, red Hulk smash. I really have trouble holding back. And I think that's because I do feel like my own experiences that I see reflected in Kratos are being rejected when people reject this character. And like I said, I told you this was going to be way more about me than you may want to know. But I think that gives me a unique ability to talk about, being a woman. You might have noticed. But also kind of connecting. I am not gender conforming in a lot of ways, and so the fact that Kratos is my spirit animal, that's a really big indicator of atypical gender performance. But that's what I took from this game, and I really, if you take one thing away from this video and this game, it's that men not even apparently show hurt differently. Typical men, I should say, should not. They don't even experience pain on a physiological level. The science is actually quite interesting. Yes, I'm saying there are gender differences. Oh my God, there are physiological differences between genders. In the majority of cases, there are times where that's not true. I'm living proof. But men don't even experience pain the same way the majority of the women do. And this is not true for all men. Some men love to talk about their feelings and their emotions and everything. And that's great. That's great. But just because a guy has a typical guy response to hurting, it doesn't mean that's wrong morally. And that doesn't mean he's not in pain. And I think we need to get better collectively at seeing the signs that a traditionally masculine man is hurting, so we don't deepen that pain. And a lot of the times that means recognizing that anger and rage and frustration are smoke screens. And it's tough to see past that anger sometimes, and you don't have to do it with everybody. People have to own their shit. But if there's somebody in your life that's important to you, don't wait for them to come to you, because they won't. Men aren't going to seek out attempts to talk. Ask them if they're okay. And if they get a little jumpy because they don't want to talk about themselves, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Don't take it personally. It's just training kicking in. Sometimes things like God of War allow guys to talk about their feelings through the discussion of a game. I know I did it. God of War 2 might have saved my life at one point by giving me a language for what I was going through that didn't feel wussy. It didn't feel weak. I could still sort of identify in a way that was strong and brave, but still have a language for what was going on, what was happening to me, and what I was doing. And video games serve a very important purpose in that way, or they can. They can start facilitating dialogue by letting guys talk about the things, and women like me, and others, Kratos fans of Kratos, you like a character because it validates something about you. And I think people need to be able to talk about these characters that they love without moral judgments. And that's not happening in gaming right now. So hope you like this video. Like I said, it was an overshare, but hope you found it interesting, at least helped you at best, put some things in context in between. And I know I enjoyed making it, even though it was a bit of a risk. And I am like Kratos. I don't like to talk about myself. And when I do, I like to use as few words as possible. So thanks for watching.